Josh here. Welcome to Rules of the Realm. Today we are going to discuss the Flooded ability. Now, this ability does not see a ton of play in Sorcery, but it is something that can happen in games. And unfortunately, there are a lot of misconceptions about exactly what Flooded does amongst new players. So the purpose of this video is to cover exactly what the Flooded ability does and what the Flooded ability does not do, so that we can eliminate some of those misconceptions. But before we dive into that, let's talk about Flooded and how it happens. So the most common thing that I think a lot of people think of when they think of Flooded is the Flood aura, because it's in the name. Flood, when it's played to an intersection, floods all the sites that it is on the surface of. But Flood kind of has a really high casting cost. It doesn't see a ton of play in the average deck. Instead, the card that you will probably encounter the most when playing Sorcery that has a flood effect is actually Floodplain. Now, this humble little site lets you flood an adjacent site during your turn. And because of that ability and what that means for a water deck, if you're not running 3 floodplains in your Atlas and you're playing water, I don't know what you're doing. Because you really should consider putting floodplain in any deck that runs water. So what does flooding a site actually do? Well, what's interesting is the main thing that it does actually leads to 2 changes. So when you flood a site, the site that is flooded gains a water threshold if it does not already have one. And yes, you can flood a site that already has water threshold, but it doesn't really have any effect. But let's say that you have targeted a site that does not have water threshold. It will then gain a water threshold, and that will lead to 2 changes at that site. The first is that the sub-region of the site will change from underground to underwater. The second is that the site that is flooded will join the body of water that it's adjacent to. So, in the case of floodplain, if floodplain floods a site, that site will join the floodplain's body of water. Pretty simple, right? That's all that it does. But there are some little tricks, some things that this does do, and some things it doesn't do. So let's talk about the cool things you can do when you flood a site that doesn't yet have water threshold. First, let's focus on the sub-region. It's changing from underground to underwater. What does that mean? Well, that means that the pesky root spider that's been causing you problems all game, he's dead. Because when the subsurface of that site changes from underground to underwater, anything there that does not have submerge is heading to the cemetery. Now, that's for minions, obviously. Artifacts that are not automatons will simply just float there underneath in the water because they're inanimate objects and they don't care if they're floating in water or if they're sitting on a cave floor. It doesn't matter to them unless they're a minion and an automaton. So, minions underground, all of a sudden it's underwater. They don't have submerge. That's it. They're done. So that's one of the really cool things you can do, especially with a card like Floodplain, where you don't have to pay for the effect. It's just something you can do every turn. So it's a good way to get rid of root spiders that try to encroach on your territory. And proper placement of a Floodplain can really protect a number of your sites from a root spider getting in. It can also potentially kill ones that are on the border of your opponent's realm that are close to you, because you can flood the site, get rid of the root spider. So that's the big real gain that you can get in terms of, killing something with it. Now, it also joins your body of water. So some effects, like the Undine, the bigger her body of water, the more power she has. So that's good. The body of water that she is in, when it expands, she gains more power. So flooding your opponent's site is awesome. That's great. Now your Undine is a more powerful creature. Very cool. So there's the gains. Now here's the things you don't get. I flooded their site. Let's say that you have a floodplain and it's in square 8. Your opponent has a step in square 13. You choose to flood their step. Awesome, it's flooded and they lose the threshold. No, they do not. Sites that are flooded do not lose the thresholds they have. So if you flood that step, your opponent's step is still going to have earth threshold and fire threshold, and now it's going to have water threshold as well until that effect ends. So you can't mess with your opponent's threshold base by flooding sites. All we're doing is adding the water threshold. Now, you may say, okay, well, I flooded the site, so everything on the surface is going to die because it's a flood. No, that doesn't happen either. Flooding in sorcery is kind of like when you're on the beach and the tide comes up and washes over your ankles. That's kind of what flooding on the surface of a site in sorcery is like. The units that are there are going to look down and their feet are wet. They don't care. It doesn't affect the units that are on the site at all. Being it flooded when they're on the surface, they don't care. With an exception. If a sandworm that is land-bound happens to be hanging out on that step, he cares deeply. Land-bound minions cannot move to water sites, even on the surface. If they do, they become disabled. So, a handy way to get rid of a sandworm, or at least disable it, is to flood the site that it's at and it's disabled. And then you can hopefully strike it and kill it without losing a minion in the process, because it is disabled and cannot strike back. But those are really the only minions that are going to be impacted on the surface of a site that's flooded. Finally, one of the other big misconceptions. Okay, I flooded this site with my wave shaper. Now it's part of my body of water. I own this site. No, you do not. You do not, in flooding the site, control it. Even though it does say my body of water, or a card might say its body of water, you don't gain control of those sites. That is not what happens. All you're doing is adding it to your body of water, and any effect that, might look at the number of sites in your body of water or something like that. That's really all that counts for. You don't suddenly control the site, let's say for example that step, and all of a sudden you can cast your minions to step. No. It's simply part of the body of water that your units are in. That's all. So, that's kind of it. Now, one final thing I do want to state about flooded. It is an ability. So anything that makes a site lose abilities will not be able to be flooded. And because lose trumps anything in its same level of application, that means that a lose effect, like smokestacks, will prevent a site from being flooded, because lose always wins. So that's just a little tip at the end. Now, let's go through this one more time. What does flooding do? The site gains a water threshold if it doesn't already have one. The subsurface changes from underground to underwater, assuming it was a land site, which means it didn't have water threshold at all. And the site joins the body of water to any sites that it is adjacent to. That's what flooding does. Nothing extra, nothing crazy. That one little caveat of you could maybe get a land-bound minion and disable him. Yeah, maybe, on the surface. But that's it. That's flooded. That concludes this installment of the Rules of the Realm series. I hope you enjoyed this particular topic, and if not, hopefully a future topic will be something more to your liking, and you will gain some knowledge about sorcery that you did not know about in that future installment. Other than that, we're done for today. So, as always, keep on contesting the realm!